Hello, everyone. I'm Craig Stover, Executive Director for Allens Lane Art Center, and welcome to ArtShow. Before we begin, big thanks to everybody who not only is tuning in to watch this evening, but a special thanks to all those people who have made donations to Allens Lane Art Center. Your support in this time of COVID is extremely important, and we can't thank you enough for helping us out. So welcome to ArtShow. Today, I have with me Maggie Mills. Hi, Maggie.
Hi.
Hi. Um, so I had a chance, Maggie, to see your studio, what was it, about a year ago, and we had arranged to have an exhibit of yours at Allens Lane, but unfortunately, COVID hit, and that really put a damper on it. So I've been sort of had you on hold for a while, and I was thrilled to have you on ArtShow. So welcome, and I can't wait to talk about your work tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So let me begin where I always begin. How did your life in the arts begin?
I think a little bit unconventionally for folks that wind up on the track that I am on now, which is kind of in academia. Um, I think that I worked my way through undergrad after having my daughter, and it took me quite a number of years to get back to graduate school. And so along the way, I raised my daughter, and I did social work, and I worked in the disability community for quite a number of years, which was an incredibly formative experience for me. And then I went to graduate school when I was 35 and my daughter was 13, and found my way into academia.
Hmm, okay. Were you making artwork all before that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've for as long as I can remember, I've um, made art. Even as a child, I was obsessed with drawing, and all through high school, and have a fine arts undergraduate degree. So I was making work the whole time, and then was laid off from a job and sort of had an epiphany that if I didn't sort of seize the opportunity, that I probably never would. And
Mhm.
so I did.
Very cool. Did you come from like an artistic household when you were growing up?
No,
Yeah.
no.
It's different for every artist. Some people were sort of, I've learned that, they were always supported and whatnot, but every once in a while there are others that just sort of seems to come out of left field. And sort of you learn later on.
My grandmother was a painter, and I was surrounded by culture, I would
Hmm.
say, growing
Mhm.
up in general. And but no, aside from my grandmother, no visual artists in my
Hmm.
household per se. My father um, was a photographer as a hobby,
Hmm.
but nothing professionally.
So we're catching you in your studio, correct?
Yes.
And have you always had this? How long have you been in this studio?
About 12 years.
Okay, nice, very established. So before COVID, did you encourage them could they come to your studio?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It was open for visits, and yeah.
And I'm assuming if COVID passes that you'll want to have it back open again.
Yes.
Yeah, that's always, I had the pleasure of actually going to your studio, and there's nothing quite like seeing the work in progress. So you had a whole bunch of things that I was thrilled to see. Um, my real first question about your artwork is the thing that struck me when I first saw your work in your studio is the scale of your work. So you do work rather large,
I
right?
do.
So
Yeah.
so why do you work that large?
Well, I think conceptually it's really important to my work.
Hmm.
And I think that is something maybe as per your comment, that's difficult to translate in printed image or digital image is the scale. They tend to be, these large color fields with tiny little things floating
Mhm.
around in them and really detailed line work and that kind of thing. Um, I am, conceptually really interested in this idea of how the flattened two-dimensional screen that we all, especially right now, are spending so very
Hmm.
much time embedded in, sort of dictates our broader aesthetics a
Hmm.
bit.
Hmm.
And so I've been working with these very kind of flattened spaces for quite a number of years that rely on these large color fields.
Hmm.
And then that sort of ties into my inspiration for most of my work, which is really rooted in um, maternal anxiety and
Hmm.
this idea that we're sort of casting our children out into this very strange world and land. And
Hmm.
so I see a real dialogue between that strange land from an environmental perspective,
Hmm.
out in the sort of literal world, and the strange flattening of spaces and the strange sort of unregulated world that exists in the screen. And so, this really started with my maternal anxiety for my daughter. And
Hmm.
when she was young, I obsessively painted her.
Hmm.
And as she got older, I really started to understand that she was kind of a proxy for an entire generation,
Hmm.
or several subsequent generations. And so it became really important to me to have children placed in these
Hmm.
really vast, really sort of bleak open landscapes that reference both, the environmentally stressed part of the world outside, and that sort of um, Wild West environment that exists in the digital realm for our
Well, I
kids.
can totally sympathize and understand exactly what you're talking about. When my daughter was born, she made it her way into my work as well. So you got to have that. So looking at your work, there are, especially within the last several years, I'm always noticing there's always some sort of a figure, usually a child, and they're in these sort of surreal landscapes. Where does your where do you pick up your source material for these images? I'd be curious.
So I've done several sort of extended series over the last few years, and I
Uh-huh.
think um, a good bit of the work you saw when you were at my studio was from two series. The one of the series that I've been working on for the last couple of years is specific to a climate change event.
Hmm.
So each painting is labeled with the place and the time for the climate change event, and for a species of animal that passes through the
Mm-hmm.
event, who their migration pattern might pass through where the event happened, where there might be some question to how that event will affect the way they migrate or the way they eat, or
Mm-hmm.
the way, the sort of trajectory of their future. So this painting is about Nelchina caribou, which are in Alaska,
Mm-hmm.
and is from the forest fires in August of 2019.
Hmm. So
So
did you say that you referenced these events? Do you list them on the? How would anybody know about these events?
well, the title of this one is, I sort of hope that the way I both make my paintings and I title them
Mhm.
are um, lead people to want to investigate these
Mhm.
things. And so this one is Nelchina caribou. Well, I also label them with the season. So this one is summer, and then in parentheses, Nelchina caribou, Alaska, August 2019.
Is that
So,
is that on the back that you do that?
well, that would be the title.
Okay.
If it were hung, that would be the title of the piece.
Okay.
So I am hopeful that it's enough information for people to wonder what happened in
Mhm.
Alaska in August of 2019, and then to wonder why I'm referencing a specific animal, and
Mhm.
to just sort of take an interest in how um, what's going on with climate change affects both geography
Mhm.
and the species of animals that live in the area.
So I'm curious about, so the actual images themselves. Do you use photographic references when you're making your work,
I
or is it invented?
so it's really important for me, and this is something that's become conceptually important to me as it relates to that idea of that kind of like unregulated digital screen,
Hmm.
is that I do a lot of reading. When I make a painting, I will look at different climate change databases. I'll look at articles from the time of the event. I'll research images of animals and landscape. It's important for me to reference like species of flora too. I mean, yeah, and but to take that information and distill it and make it my own image. I
Hmm.
think in the age of the internet, you can Google caribou and 50,000 images pop up. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So there's certainly no shortage of source material, and that the ease with which images can be kind of appropriated.
Hmm.
So it's really important to me. I mean, my first love was drawing, and I
Hmm.
still love drawing
Hmm.
so much. So it's really important to me when I'm making my work to look at a whole bunch of images
Hmm.
and sort of think about what might be my own kind of um, my own kind of iconography for
Hmm.
those images, and sort of distill the most important parts of things and then build my own imagery from that and make my own drawings from that.
Okay. Well,
So
I can see clearly that drawing is, you're a fantastic draftsman, and that it's the basis for your images. It has to be, right? So, I mean, I guess what I was trying to get at, I was wondering, with your daughter, do you ever take photographs of her or use her for the source material for the children that are in your works?
yeah, so it used to be my daughter and my poor nephews, my
Hmm.
three nephews were, every family gathering, I was asking them, look gloomier, look this way, no smiling. So they became really used to that, and I painted them quite a bit.
Unpaid
Um,
models.
and that what's that?
Unpaid models. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And now it has sort of branched out to me sort of stalking my friends' kids and their
Hmm.
Instagram accounts, and then, sending them a text and saying, "Hey, do you mind if I," and so I'll draw their children, and unbeknownst to them, then place them in some horrifying, bleak climate apocalypse
I get
landscape.
you. So, tell me a little bit about, with your type of work. For me as an artist, I look at it and I am really intrigued by your process. So I'm curious, do you keep sketchbooks?
I used to keep a lot of paper sketchbooks. Now I have a flat file drawer or two that is just packed with little drawings that I
Uh-huh.
save. But I have this process where I work um, analog, digital, analog, digital. So basically, I'll do a bunch of drawings
Hmm.
of like my sort of source material. And then I have these, big canvases. I'm about to start a new painting, and they are 5 foot by 5 foot, 4 feet by 5 feet. They're large surfaces. So
Hmm.
I'll prepare my canvas, I'll do my drawings, and I'll sit in my studio and just sort of move things around on the canvas because I really love the design process.
Hmm.
So I'll do that for a bit, and then I might go in and scan my drawings and scale them up or
Hmm.
down for what I feel is the best composition. And then I transfer to my canvas. I might start a painting, photograph it, come inside, bring it into Photoshop, and play around with, color, and or
Hmm.
maybe adding something or taking something away, and then move back to my studio.
Hmm.
Um, it this way of working with these really big open spaces is not as easy as it probably seems for people that don't work this way. and
Hmm.
and the first number of years that I worked this way, I spent an inordinate amount of time painting things out and sanding things and
Mhm.
trying to get the surface back to something that had some integrity,
Mhm.
because I think in the beginning I put a lot more in my paintings to begin with, and then worked in this kind of subtractive
Mhm.
process that was really, really labor intensive.
Mm.
And I've become more comfortable with starting emptier and
Mhm.
having that additive process be a little bit more meditative, I think,
Mhm. Mhm.
as I've gotten more into working this way. And I think having that digital space to sort of take things for a test run is really nice too, because it helps me to kind of preserve the integrity of some of the surfaces of my canvas, because it's really important to me to have a certain kind of paint in
Mhm.
each space in my painting, so that things sit in different spaces. And I can
Mhm.
talk about that more if you're interested.
Sure. Well, for me, I see what you're saying about sort of streamlining the process, and it allows you to really spend more time on the image itself rather than the process of creating it. So I understand that. I'm curious about, you know, it's fascinating to hear that you've got these references going on to either a historical event or a climate change event, and then you're using these figures that you're sort of changing and manipulating, so you're really creating a story in it. But the one part that I think is so fascinating is, um, there's a real, for a lot of the works that I've seen anyway, there's a real element of a surrealist space. That so it's not just, I mean, the piece behind you is a little bit different because, that's, I don't see that quite as surrealist as some of the other works. I don't know if that's the newest piece or whatnot, but so there's another piece that's behind you, to your left, where that space, right? So that's really, it's almost like a Dali space, like this invented anything could happen space. So where does that surrealism part come in?
Well, that space was actually, that's part of the series that I did before this series, which was equating a contributing factor or a result of climate change to the plagues. So that painting is actually called Lice, and in parentheses is Monsanto.
Mhm.
So that was really about big agriculture. And so the spaces, like I said, I think the surrealist sort of effect comes from the process. It
Mhm.
comes from me thinking about, um, what kinds of things are symbolic of that process of big agriculture, which made me think about, once years ago, driving home from the Delaware beaches, and there's all that farmland on the
Mhm.
drive, and seeing those huge industrial sprinklers, and wondering what's coming out of them, and so I go through this process
Mhm.
intellectually, and then I think in the process of distilling that imagery down to something that is kind of my own kind of coded
Mhm.
language, my own sort of symbolic language or iconography,
Mhm.
it gets distilled into something that is really very logical for me, but I think
Uh-huh.
it's this very personal language, so maybe appears a little more surreal or coded
Right.
to
So it's
other
actually like
people.
almost like a mindscape rather than a surrealist approach to it.
I think it really comes from that distillation of the imagery and sort of breaking things down
Mhm.
into what I feel is their essential parts,
Mhm.
which may not read as sort of, a conventional image to other people. And I think the other thing that contributes to, well, two other things. I think one is that I'm working with these flattened digital
Mhm.
spaces, and so I'm really, in the absence of like having, naturalistic light and
Mhm.
thinking about, things being subject to light and shadow over the sort of grand scale. I mean, individual elements in my images are subject to
Mhm.
naturalistic light, but the landscape overall is this like sort of flattened color field
Yeah.
space. And I
Mhm.
think in the absence of that kind of conventional traditional space, you also have to code your space,
Mhm.
right? You also have to force things to sit in a certain place in space. And
Mhm.
so the way that I do that is number one, color theory, because I'm a color nerd. And
Hmm.
the other way I do it is sort of, you know, sectioning off little spaces and handling the paint very specifically in those spaces.
Hmm.
So, something that I want to sit in a certain space, I might sort of plan ahead. Okay, I'm going to stain that and pour that many, many times. And when that's done, then I can come in and I can cut the next
Hmm.
layer over top of it. And that's going to be opaque paint. But then something,
Hmm.
over here is going to sit in the space differently. So, I have to really think about the kind of paint that I'm using,
Hmm.
and the kind of opacity or transparency of the paint in those different spaces to force that idea of
Yeah.
it's almost like a puppet show a puppet show theater that has these
Right.
kind of like stacked layers coming out of paper or whatever, and then you have the figures moving through it. So I think about it that way, and I think that's part of what contributes to that as well.
It's amazing the number of artists I talk to that think in layers. It's everything from even from printmakers to sculptors to painters, and I think how well Photoshop now dovetails into that, building in those sort of layers. Uh,
Absolutely.
I love it. I love that sort of commonality, that the artistic process, the way it's sort of thought out beforehand, and it has each step. So one of the things that you had mentioned in your last bit was you were talking about color. So I'm a big color nerd myself. And the first thing that struck me when I'm seeing your work is your color palette. You tend to soften the vast majority of your colors. They're very light and whatnot, which is, it's almost the opposite of what a lot of people would think, because when they talk about work that's, you know, has a storyline of conservation or climate catastrophe, they always sort of rush to those sort of hard edges and whatnot. But you have this sort of color palette that you've been able to wash over. It's almost like a wash, really, over the entire storyline. Can you tell me where this sort of lightness of your color comes from?
Yeah. I work with these really constrained palettes usually.
Hmm.
So I never start I use three colors in white in
Hmm.
my palettes all the time, and they shift a little bit, and sometimes it'll be a pretty traditional kind of primary palette, but I like to play with, like, two primaries and a secondary, and white. So I'm already starting from this like kind of really constrained space.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I love to think about when I'm painting is, it comes in that very early part of the process, which is, okay, if I put this here, how am I going to play off of it here, and how am I going to play off of it here? So I'm sort of thinking about these color rhythms. But as far as the softness of the color goes, I think I'm really interested, again, conceptually, in that line between, children have the painting children has the real possibility of being this kind of like cliched, very saccharine sweet kind of endeavor with
Hallmark.
smiling children, and it's a dangerous kind of
Right.
territory to tread in as a painter. And so it's important for me that they're in these really bleak places, and they
Hmm.
sort of feel a little dislocated and a little lost. But
Hmm.
I also want these places to feel um, digitally possible. So I want them to feel um, like they could be environments that children could be in these kind
Hmm.
of like pastel-y
Hmm.
color schemes. But it's always sort of riding that line between like bleakness and softness.
Hmm. So curious, we are hoping that eventually, when COVID goes back and we can have art shows again, we'd love to have you actually. We'll pick up that thread. Uh, my curious, weird question is could I ever get you to exhibit some of your sketchbooks along with the works?
I mean, they are, yes, they are single pieces of paper that are
Yeah.
often ripped and have scotch tape on the ends,
Yeah.
and so they're pretty weathered. I used to not save them,
Mm-hmm.
and then a couple years ago was looking for an old drawing and realized that I had tossed it, and at the time thought it was a bad drawing, but
Mm-hmm.
in hindsight realized it was actually a decent drawing and wished
Mm-hmm.
I had still had that drawing.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to save them. And then as I think is happening to most of us, my work has been on a strange path
Mm-hmm.
since things have been in
Right.
lockdown. I broke my ankle really badly and couldn't get into the studio for many months. So, and it coincided with
Yeah.
the lockdown. So I was sort of really limited. And so I
Mm-hmm.
started working on smaller drawings, smaller mixed media pieces with
Mm-hmm.
gouache and watercolor and graphite. And so
Okay.
that's become a little bit of a um, sketchbook for me as well, that I've been sort of simultaneously thinking about getting back to bigger paintings, but also working on these. They're not super tiny, but for me, tiny,
Comparatively, right? Yeah.
2 by 3 feet, 1.5 by 2 feet, that sort of thing, which is pretty small for me.
Well, I would love to be able to do that because I found that when people see, they walk into a gallery, the vast majority of people, it's new work for them to look at, and anything that we can do to help them, understand the process. People love to learn about the processes that artists take because it gives them sort of an entryway into the work. For just this little conversation that we're having, I'm now seeing your work completely different, just learning about your sort of source materials and how that's sort of being put together. So we'll talk about that at a later time, but I would love to do that. Let's talk just a little bit about the mediums, because you usually work in oil paints, correct? But you said that you started to do some gouache works, right? I'm a big fan of gouache. I love that medium. Everything from watercolor to acrylic. You can do so much with that, and I look forward to seeing those sort of things. My curious question is do you ever work or ever want to work in any sort of other mediums? So I'd be curious, like, have you ever explored printmaking or sculpture, or, to be quite honest, theater or literary?
Yeah,
Did
interesting.
you
I
ever
mean,
do that? Because your work, I think, lends itself to these sort of cross things. I'd be curious if have you ever thought about it? Is this something you want to do?
well, I am a printmaker as well, and I do
Okay.
show some prints, and then they sort of like, I don't have. I was doing all hand printing, and um, I'm every printmaking professor's worst nightmare because I'm a painter, and so I'm incapable of making an edition.
Hmm.
I mean, there's coffee in the
Right.
borders, and I rip my paper, and I mean, so I had a really kind professor in undergrad who suggested that first I start just bleeding my edges, and then maybe start investigating Shinkalay and working more in like a kind of like one-off capacity.
Hmm.
And I love monotype and I love relief.
Hmm.
So next to me, you can't see, there's a stack of about, I don't know, 100
Okay.
old carved wood blocks under my table.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah, and printmaking actually was really formative for my painting, um, because I could print a whole bunch of like just sort of singular images
Right.
and then cut things out and sort of spread them out on my studio floor and start to compose,
Hmm.
on a piece of
Right.
paper, and maybe put a monotype behind it, or so it was really, really helpful to me process wise.
Hmm.
So I do love printmaking, and then I actually, for a few years, I taught theater design at Temple.
There you go. I knew it was
So
in there somewhere.
yeah, and it was always felt like such a perfect fit for me
Yeah.
because I think, like I said, I think of my work as these little mini theater sets with things sort of moving through them, and I'm just sort of arranging in there. So
Yeah.
um, I taught a hybrid graduate undergraduate class at Temple of students who were doing set lighting and costume design. It
Hmm.
was a blast. It was a great class to teach.
I can totally see you doing that. I mean, your work would lend itself so well We have to figure out some way to get you to do some sets or something. That would be fantastic. And I am going to put you on the spot and hold you. I would love to see on your website or social media. I need to see some of these prints. Right? You
I
please
have I
post
have a
some.
few photographs of old ones, but they have sort of
That's
faded
okay.
out.
Great art doesn't matter when it was made. I would love to see it, and I'm sure your fans would too, because it helps lend itself to your voice. You have a bigger voice when you are able to explore those different mediums. Sculpture at all?
Yeah, I did some sculpture in undergrad. I got really into welding and concrete work. Um,
Really?
yeah, yeah. And, I mean, there is definitely a thread because I think even in that work, it was kind of, I was really interested in how those two surfaces interacted with each other and different finishes that I could put on concrete and how I could attach them. And so I think there was really, a collage feel
Mm-hmm.
in that work too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would, again, more photos. I want to see a few of those as well. Even if they're not ready for prime time, you just email them to me.
I don't even know if I have. I haven't done sculpture in so many years, but my husband is actually a sculptor. So
Really?
yeah, there's a lot of that
And he's
around
not
the
trying to
house.
nudge you to say, hey, create something, or here's some materials or something. No, or is it all separate? Like you do your work,
We're,
I'll do mine.
we work so very differently. I'm a a rethinker and a sketcher and
Uh-huh.
always moving things around and always reassessing and editing. And he is very much, he builds a huge form, he pours the concrete, and
Uh-huh.
then if he doesn't like it, that's it. He's never going to try it again. If he likes it, he's good with it.
Have you ever guys done a show together?
A couple little things here
Okay.
and there over the years. Yeah, but
Well, I'd love to see that. So I got sort of one more question for you here, which is, so we talked a lot about the work that you had been doing, especially during COVID, and you said you did smaller works. What are you currently working on?
so I just finished a smaller gouache, watercolor, and graphite drawing, and that is the fifth or sixth in the series, I believe.
On
And then,
paper?
what's that?
Are they on paper?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then right now, I am drawing a figure and a dog getting ready to have a 5 foot by 5 foot stretcher frame waiting to have a canvas stretched on it. So I'm working on the drawing now, and
Okay.
I'll be starting that painting shortly.
Is it still?
Really, really looking forward to a big surface
So
again.
this will be like the first big one since sort of COVID hit and you've had to scale back. Is it
Yeah,
a new series, or is it still a continuation of, say, like this part of the series, the one behind you?
it's part of this series, which is called Monuments,
Okay.
which is just really really trying to memorialize some of these things that have been happening climate wise over the last several years, and
Mhm,
the acceleration of these
mhm,
kinds of really intense climate events.
mhm. Well, I look forward to seeing it, and hopefully, you can post a little bit more about I want to see this painting. That's going to be my number one thing. Um, well, gee, time has flown by. It was great talking to you today. And before I go, I do want to thank again everybody who tuned in today to see the interview with Maggie. Thank you very much for tuning in today. And also a big thank you to all those people who have made donations to Allen's Lane Art Center to help out with the art show and the other programs that we have. Thank you very much. And we very much look forward to seeing you on another episode of Art Show. So again, thank you, Maggie, for your time today. Really appreciate it. It's always a
Thanks so
pleasure
much for
talking
having
to
me.
you. And
Thanks
I
for
look
having me.
forward to hopefully having the show with you here at Allen's Lane in the future.
Great.
So thanks again. Have a nice night, everyone.